There's something I need this room to hear. Claire is no longer an heir to this family's name. Now, thank you all for another record year.
Claire Whitmore was 29 years old the night her father stood in front of 300 people and told them she was no longer his daughter. She did not see it coming until the exact second it happened. Nobody in that ballroom did. One moment, her father was thanking donors for another record-breaking year at the podium he had stood behind a dozen times before. And the next moment, he was looking directly at her, in front of every person who had watched her grow up, telling them her name no longer belonged to his family. She has said, since that night, that she remembers the sound of the room going quiet more clearly than she remembers her father's actual words, because silence like that does not happen by accident in a room full of people who know exactly what they just heard. Somewhere near the back of that ballroom, a phone was already recording. Nobody there could have known it yet, but the video being captured in that moment would travel further and faster than anything Harold Whitmore's company had built in 40 years of careful, deliberate business. By the time Claire and the man she loved reached the parking lot, strangers 2,000 miles away were already watching her father say the words that ended her place in his family. And by the time she woke up the next morning, her name was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone with an opinion about what a father is allowed to do to his daughter in front of a crowd. What almost nobody watching that video understood, not at first, was that this was never really a story about one man's temper, because Harold Whitmore did not lose his temper that night. He had planned exactly what he was going to say. He had chosen exactly where to say it. And the reason behind his decision reached back much further than anyone in that room could have guessed, back to a name none of them had ever heard, buried in his own family's history, a secret Harold himself had spent decades trying to forget he ever knew. Stay with this story, because before it is finished, you are going to watch a billionaire's carefully built empire nearly collapse under the weight of a decision he made in less than 60 seconds. And you are going to find out exactly what he was really protecting when he gave his daughter up in front of everyone she had ever known. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Here is what you need to know before this story really begins. Harold Whitmore was not an impulsive man. In 40 years of building Whitmore Industries into one of the most recognized names in American real estate and finance, he had never once been described by the people who worked closest to him as reckless or careless with his decisions. He was, by every account, the opposite. He weighed decisions the way other men weighed investments, slowly, privately, and only after he was certain of the outcome. That is exactly why what he did to his daughter in that ballroom unsettled the people who knew him best far more than if he had simply lost his temper. A man who never acts without calculating the cost had just made the most public, most devastating decision of his life, on purpose, in front of cameras he knew were in the room. 3 questions are going to carry you through the rest of this story, and I want you to hold on to them, because the answers are not what they appear to be on the surface. First, was Harold Whitmore's decision really about his daughter's choice of the man she loved? Or was there something underneath that reason, something older, something he had been carrying since long before Claire was even born? Second, once that decision was made in front of 300 witnesses, how far was Harold actually willing to go to defend it? And who else would get hurt in the process, including people who had absolutely nothing to do with his daughter's engagement? And third, the question you will not have a real answer to until the very end of this story. Did Harold Whitmore ever come to regret what he did? And if he did, was it already too late for it to matter to the people he had hurt? Claire Whitmore had spent almost her entire life trying to be exactly the kind of daughter her father wanted, and on one Saturday night in early autumn, none of it mattered anymore. The man standing beside her, the one her father had just publicly rejected in front of everyone she had ever known, was a trauma surgeon named Marcus Coleman, a man who had built his entire life from nothing, and had never once expected to be treated as a problem that needed to be managed. What happened to both of them after that ballroom emptied out is a story about money, pride, and a family secret that had been buried for 3 generations, waiting for exactly this moment to come back into the light. To understand what happened in that ballroom, you have to go back to the man Harold Whitmore was long before Claire was born. He did not build Whitmore Industries out of nothing, though he liked people to believe he had. His father, Edmund Whitmore, left him a modest real estate portfolio and something far heavier, a set of unspoken rules about how a Whitmore was supposed to behave in public. Harold spent his 20s and 30s turning that modest portfolio into a national company, and he spent every year after making sure the Whitmore name meant something specific: discipline, respectability, control. He sat on the boards of 2 hospitals and a university. He was the kind of man whose photograph appeared in the business section far more often than the society pages, and that had always been exactly how he wanted it. At home, Harold ran his household the way he ran his boardrooms. Dinner was at 7 o'clock without exception. Opinions were welcome as long as they aligned with his own. His wife, Diane, had learned decades earlier that peace in the house was worth more than being right, and she rarely challenged him directly anymore, though the people who had known her before the marriage remembered a woman with a sharper tongue and far stronger opinions than the one who now deferred to her husband at every dinner table. His son, Wesley, had been groomed since childhood to take over the company one day, and he wore that expectation the way some men wear an ill-fitting suit, uncomfortably, but never quite willing to take it off. Claire had grown up inside that same house, but she never fully absorbed the rules the way her brother did. She loved architecture because it was the one part of her life that felt entirely her own, a field her father had not chosen for her and did not fully understand. She built a career independent of the Whitmore name as much as that was possible, taking a junior position at a firm under a slightly different professional presentation for her first 2 years, wanting to know whether she could succeed without her father's shadow attached to every project she touched. She had dated within her father's approved social circle for most of her 20s, men whose families Harold recognized from country clubs and charity boards, and none of those relationships had ever lasted more than a year. Claire met Marcus Coleman on a Tuesday night in the emergency waiting room of a hospital, where she had accompanied a coworker after a minor accident on a job site. Marcus was the surgeon on call that evening. Their first real conversation happened almost by accident, in a hallway, while they were both waiting on paperwork neither of them wanted to be filling out, and it lasted 45 minutes neither of them had planned to spend that way. Marcus had grown up in a small house outside Columbus, Ohio, raised by his mother after his father left when he was 6 years old. He worked his way through college on scholarships and loans, and he built his career the slow, exhausting way, without a family name to open a single door for him. When people asked Marcus what drove him, he usually gave the same honest answer. He had watched his mother work 2 jobs just to keep their lights on, and he had promised himself, as a boy, that he would spend his life fixing the kinds of emergencies that used to terrify him. Claire and Marcus dated quietly for over a year before she introduced him to her family. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. Privately, she suspected there was no such thing as the right moment, not with her father, and that she was simply delaying an outcome she already feared more than she wanted to admit to herself or to Marcus. The first time Harold met Marcus, at a small dinner Claire arranged at her own apartment rather than her parents' house, Harold was polite in the specific, careful way he reserved for people he had already decided not to take seriously. He asked Marcus about his residency, his specialty, his 5-year plan, the way a man interviews a job candidate rather than gets to know his daughter's partner. Diane noticed it. Wesley noticed it. Marcus noticed it too, though he said nothing about it to Claire that night, not wanting to make her father's coldness her burden to carry on top of everything else she was already carrying that evening. Afterward, in the car, Harold told Claire only that Marcus seemed like a serious young man, a phrase Claire would later come to recognize as the closest her father ever came, in that period, to revealing what he actually thought. She did not yet know that her father had already begun making calls, quietly, to people who might know something about the Colemans. In the same methodical way, he researched a company before deciding whether to acquire it. Marcus proposed to Claire on a Sunday morning in the spring, at the small overlook where they had gone on their first weekend trip together, years earlier, back when neither of them fully understood what they were building. Claire said yes before he had even finished the sentence. She called her mother first, not her father, and Diane's reaction, warm but careful, told Claire something she had been avoiding admitting to herself for months. Her mother was happy for her, and afraid for her at exactly the same time, in a way that made both feelings impossible to fully separate from each other. Claire told her father in person at his office, deliberately choosing neutral ground rather than the family house where every conversation seemed to carry extra weight. Harold listened without interrupting, which Claire initially mistook for a good sign. When she finished speaking, he asked her only one question. Had she thought carefully about what this decision would mean, not just for her but for the family? Claire told him she had thought about nothing else for over a year, and that her answer had not changed no matter how many times she turned it over in her mind. Harold nodded, said he needed time, and ended the meeting without another word. For 6 weeks, Harold said almost nothing further about the engagement, and the silence sat over the family like whether nobody wanted to name out loud. Diane tried twice to raise the subject with him privately and was told both times that he would handle it in his own time, in his own way. Wesley, caught between his father and his sister, avoided the topic with both of them, which Claire noticed and resented more than open hostility might have provoked in her. During those 6 weeks, Harold made a series of quiet inquiries through Nathaniel Cross, his longtime attorney, into the Coleman family's background, Marcus's finances, and his professional standing at the hospital. Nathaniel found nothing that could remotely be called a problem, a fact he reported to Harold directly and which Harold received without any visible reaction at all. What Harold was actually searching for, Nathaniel would later admit privately, was never really a reason. It was a justification for a decision Harold had already made the very day Claire told him about the engagement, a decision he simply needed time to build a case for, even if that case was only ever going to be presented to himself. The annual Whitmore Industries charity gala had been scheduled for months before Claire's engagement, and canceling her attendance would have raised more questions than it answered. So Claire came, with Marcus at her side, in front of the same circle of families who had watched her grow up from a child into a woman. Harold greeted them both at the door with practiced warmth that fooled almost everyone in the room except his wife and his son, both of whom had spent a lifetime learning to read the particular stillness in his jaw whenever he was containing something he had not yet decided to release. Midway through the evening, Harold asked for the room's attention, ostensibly to thank donors for another successful year of fundraising. He spoke for several minutes about the foundation's work before turning, without warning, to address his daughter directly, in front of the entire room, and inform everyone present that Claire Whitmore would no longer be recognized as his daughter or as an heir to the Whitmore name, effective immediately.
There's something I need this room to hear. Claire is no longer an heir to this family's name. Now thank you all for another record year.
Because of her choice of partner, he used the word standards. He did not raise his voice even slightly. He thanked the room again for their generosity and stepped down from the podium as calmly as if he had just finished delivering a quarterly earnings report to shareholders. For a long moment, nobody in the ballroom moved at all. Diane stood frozen near the head table, one hand pressed flat against her chest. Wesley started toward his sister and then stopped, caught between two people he could not fully choose between in front of 300 witnesses. Claire stood perfectly still, Marcus's hand finding hers. While the room's attention shifted toward her in the particular way a crowd turns toward an accident, unable to look away even as they understood, somewhere underneath their curiosity, that they were intruding on something they had no right to witness. A guest near the back had been filming a portion of Harold's speech for a charity recap video, and without realizing what he was capturing, he recorded the entire disownment from beginning to end. That footage would leave the ballroom before Claire and Marcus had even reached the parking lot outside. By the following morning, the recording had already been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Business journalists who had never previously covered Whitmore Industries as anything other than a real estate firm were suddenly writing about Harold Whitmore's personal life for the first time in his career. The company's communications team, blindsided entirely, spent the weekend fielding calls they had no approved language to answer. Harold refused to issue any statement, telling his team privately that a man does not explain his family to strangers, a position that only fed the story rather than starving it the way he had intended. Public reaction split quickly along familiar lines, and for the first time in his career, Harold Whitmore found himself unable to control which version of the story reached the public first. Some defended him as a private man entitled to his own household decisions, entitled to run his family exactly as he saw fit without outside interference. Far more condemned him outright, and several of the company's institutional partners began quietly asking Whitmore Industries, board what, if anything, the company intended to do about the reputational exposure now attached to the family name. Claire and Marcus retreated from public view almost entirely in the first 2 weeks, staying at Marcus's apartment rather than the home Claire had been renting near her family's estate for the past 3 years. Claire's access to the family trust that had partially funded her early career was frozen within days, on Harold's direct instruction, and the architecture firm where she worked, which had significant business ties to Whitmore Industries, quietly suggested she take an extended leave for her own well-being, a suggestion Claire understood immediately as a pressure tactic she had no real power to resist without losing the career she had spent years building for herself. Marcus, for his part, faced a smaller but sharper version of the same pressure. A member of the hospital's fundraising board, a longtime friend of Harold's, raised pointed questions about Marcus's fit for an upcoming department leadership opening. He had been the leading internal candidate for months. Nothing was said outright. Nothing needed to be said outright for Marcus to understand exactly what was happening around him. He recognized the pattern from stories his mother had told him his entire life, and recognizing it did not make it any easier to sit inside once it was finally happening to him directly. Wesley Whitmore, more disturbed by the gala than he had let his father see that night, began quietly asking Nathaniel cross questions of his own in the weeks that followed. He wanted to understand what, specifically, his father had actually been looking for during those 6 weeks of inquiries, and whether there was more to his father's reaction than the explanation Harold had given the entire ballroom. Nathaniel, uncomfortable but loyal to the family more broadly than to Harold as an individual, told Wesley only that some things went back further than Wesley probably realized, and that he was not the right person to explain the rest of it to him. That answer unsettled Wesley more than a direct refusal ever could have. He began, carefully and without telling his father, going through old family records stored at the company's private archive facility, records he had never before had any reason to examine, searching for whatever it was that Nathaniel had been so unwilling to say to him directly. Diane, meanwhile, had not spoken to her daughter since the night of the gala, not out of any real agreement with her husband, but out of a paralysis she was privately ashamed of every single day that passed. She began, quietly, meeting Claire for coffee without telling Harold, small acts of contact that felt at once insufficient and dangerous to both of them. During one of those meetings, Diane told Claire something she had never once said aloud before. Harold's own mother, Claire's great-grandmother, had a story in the family nobody ever discussed, one Diane herself had only pieced together in fragments over more than 30 years of marriage to Harold. Claire pressed her mother for details. Diane, visibly uncomfortable even saying it, told her only that Edmund Whitmore, Harold's father, had once done something similar to his own sister decades earlier, and that whatever had happened had been buried so thoroughly that even Harold himself might not know the full story behind it. It was the first thread connecting Harold's decision to something older and larger than Claire's own relationship, and it would not be the last thread Claire would find. On the Whitmore Industries board, a director named Preston Vale watched the unfolding scandal with an attention that had very little to do with Claire's well-being at all. Vale had spent nearly 2 years positioning himself to challenge Harold's control of the company, and the public relations crisis handed him an opening he had never expected to receive so easily. He began, carefully, reaching out to other board members, framing the scandal not as a private family matter, but as a governance risk, one that raised legitimate questions about Harold's judgment and the company's growing exposure. He was careful never to say outright that he wanted Harold removed from his position. He did not need to say it directly for the idea to begin taking root among directors who were already nervous about falling investor sentiment. Inside the archive, Wesley found a folder of old correspondence, decades old, between Edmund Whitmore and a lawyer who had been Nathaniel Cross's predecessor at the firm. The letters revealed that Edmund's younger sister, a woman named Margaret Whitmore, had been removed from the family's will and cut off entirely from all contact with the family back in the 1960s, after she married a man the family considered beneath their standing, for reasons the letters made uncomfortably explicit in Edmund's own handwriting. The family had never spoken of Margaret again after that. Records showed she had died decades later in another state entirely, with no Whitmore family member listed among her survivors at the time of her death. Wesley brought the letters directly to Nathaniel, demanding to know whether his father was aware of this history. Nathaniel admitted, reluctantly, that Harold had learned some version of this story as a young man, from his own father, framed at the time not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of how a family protects itself from outside influence. Harold had absorbed that lesson exactly as Edmund intended him to. He had simply never expected to be the one applying it to his own daughter, decades later, in a ballroom full of witnesses and cameras. Wesley confronted his father with the letters at the company's headquarters, away from Diane and away from the press entirely. Harold's reaction was not the outrage Wesley had braced himself for walking into that meeting. It was something closer to recognition, a flicker of a man being shown a mirror he had spent his entire life carefully avoiding. Harold did not deny the connection once it was laid out in front of him. He told Wesley only that he had believed he was protecting the family's standing the same way his own father had once taught him to protect it, and that believing it had not made it any easier to hear. Now, how closely his own actions mirrored a decision he had grown up quietly considering a family shame. For the first time in this entire story, Harold did not have a prepared response ready. Wesley left that meeting without any real resolution, but with the unmistakable sense that something inside his father had finally cracked, even if his father was not yet ready to admit that publicly to anyone, including himself. While Harold sat alone with the weight of what Wesley had shown him, Preston Vale's quiet campaign among the board finally reached its conclusion. At an emergency board session, Vale formally proposed a vote of no confidence in Harold's leadership, citing the reputational damage from the gala and the company's declining investor sentiment in recent weeks. The vote was close, far closer than Harold had expected from men he had considered loyal to him for 20 years or more, and it ended with Harold retaining his position by the narrowest possible margin. It was a warning shot rather than any real resolution, and everyone in that boardroom understood the difference. Harold left that meeting having survived it, but for the first time in his professional life, having understood clearly that his authority was not unconditional, that the empire he had spent decades protecting could still be taken from him by the very mechanisms he himself had built to protect it from outside threats. 3 weeks after that board meeting, Harold suffered a minor heart attack at his office, collapsing during a late meeting with Nathaniel Cross. He survived, but the hospital kept him for observation for several days, and the incident, quiet as the company tried desperately to keep it, eventually reached Diane, and through Diane, it reached Claire. Claire did not learn about it from her father. She learned about it from her mother, in a phone call that broke the silence between them for the first time since the night of the gala months earlier. Claire did not go to the hospital immediately. She sat with the decision for 2 full days, torn between the years of hurt her father had caused her and a part of herself that could not fully separate from him no matter how much had happened between them. Marcus, when she finally asked him what he thought she should do, told her only that the decision belonged entirely to her, and that whatever she chose to do, he would stand behind her without question either way. Claire went to the hospital on the 4th day. Harold was awake, thinner than she remembered him being, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. It was Harold who finally broke the silence, and what he said was not the apology Claire had imagined 100 different ways over the past several months. It was smaller than that, and in its smallness, somehow more honest than anything she had expected to hear from him. He told her he had spent his whole life being taught that protecting the family meant controlling exactly who belonged inside it, and that he had only recently begun to understand how much that particular lesson had already cost people he loved, long before Claire had even been born into the family. He did not ask her for forgiveness that day. He told her only that he wanted the chance to know his grandchild someday, if Claire and Marcus were ever willing to give him that chance, and that he understood clearly he had no real right to expect it from either of them after everything he had done. What followed in the months after was not a clean resolution by any measure. Claire did not restore her father to the role he had once held in her life, and she made clear to him, in that hospital room and in every month that followed it, that trust would have to be rebuilt slowly, entirely on her own terms, not granted automatically simply because he had finally said some of the right words to her in a hospital bed. Marcus, for his part, agreed to meet Harold again, cautiously, judging him by what he actually did next rather than by anything he had said while recovering from a heart attack. Harold began, quietly, the long process of restructuring his will and the family trust to remove the conditions he had once attached to Claire's inheritance, not as a bribe for reconciliation, but, he told Nathaniel privately, because he had finally understood what those conditions had actually been protecting all along, and it was never his family. A year later, Claire gave birth to a son. She and Marcus named him Elijah. Harold was permitted, cautiously, to visit the hospital, and Diane later said it was the first time in years she had seen her husband's composure fully give way, holding his grandson in a hospital chair, saying almost nothing for a very long time. It was not an ending that erased what had happened in that ballroom months earlier. Claire never once pretended otherwise, not to herself, and not to the people who had watched the entire story unfold from a distance through their phones and their television screens. But it was, for the first time in a long time, a beginning that did not depend on Harold's approval to exist. Harold Whitmore's decision that night in the ballroom had been meant to protect something, a name, a standard, a story his family had told about itself for generations. What it actually protected in the end was nothing at all, only the same inherited fear his own father had handed him, and his father before that, passed down quietly for so long that nobody in the family had ever thought to question where it had actually come from. It took losing his daughter, nearly losing his company, and a hospital bed to make him finally understand that the thing he had spent his entire life guarding had never needed guarding in the first place. Was Harold Whitmore's late change of heart real, or was it simply the last calculation of a man who understood, finally, exactly what he stood to lose? That question was never fully answered, not by Harold himself, and not by the family who spent the following years quietly learning whether or not to believe him. So here is the question worth sitting with. Harold Whitmore spent his entire life protecting a version of his family that, in the end, he was only protecting out of inherited fear rather than any belief he had ever actually formed on his own. How many decisions, in how many families watching this right now, get made the exact same way, passed down quietly without ever being questioned, until someone finally refuses to accept them any longer? Do you think Harold's change of heart came too late to matter, or is it ever truly too late for a family to find its way back to each other? Let us know in the comments what part of this story affected you the most, and if you have lived through anything even close to what Claire and Marcus went through, we would genuinely like to hear about it, if you are willing to share it with us. And if this story stayed with you, wait until you hear what happened in the next family we are covering, where an inheritance dispute uncovered a secret nobody in that family had spoken of out loud in almost 60 years. Subscribe for more real stories of families tested by pride, money, and the choices that follow people long after the room has finally gone quiet.